Hi, I'm Bob Whitty with KPND in Sandpoint, Idaho. If I can be a fan of Skylight Books, LA's world-famous independent bookstore, from way up here in the Idaho Panhandle, then you can too from wherever you are. Visit the website, buy some books. You can even join their membership club and reap the benefits of supporting independent booksellers. Thanks.
Meet me on the softer side. Meet me on the softer side. Softer side of your heart.
Hi there, and welcome to the Skylight Books author reading series. You can find out about this and all of our other author events at www.skylightbooks.com, where you can also browse our inventory as well as order books online. You can also follow us on Twitter or even be our friend at facebook.com. If you'd like to talk to a real person, we can be reached at 323-660-1175. And don't forget, Skylight Books depends on listeners like you to help support us. So whether you're in our neighborhood or browsing online, buy a book or two to help ensure that we'll be around for a long, long time. Thanks and enjoy.
And now it's time for me to introduce our speaker for tonight, Richard Hell. And I can tell by the number of you that are here that I don't need to convince you about how influential he's been, about how great television, the Heartbreakers, the Voidoids, how great all those bands are. But I do want to tell you about how great his book is, so I'm a book person, and how well received it's been. I Dreamed I Was a Very Clean Tramp was praised by Legs McNeil as an exquisite snapshot of early punk possibility that so beautifully captures the exuberance of starting a band. The New York Times Book Review writes, Hell is a real writer, and his book has traction from its first pages. And Kathleen Hanna says, Tramp gave me the feeling I had when I read as a kid. I cozied up and fell in love with a world that wasn't mine. There are very few books that make me want to start writing my own. This is one of them. We're absolutely thrilled that he's here, and I know that you are too. So let's just give him a huge welcome. Richard Hell.
Hey. Hi. Sorry for that little false start there. I had to make a stop next door. But I'm disoriented anyway. I've been driving for the past week. We started in Seattle and made stops down the coast, but LA kind of has that disorienting effect on me anyway. I mean, it's really strange. I'd forgotten what it felt like to me. Because, though I did once, when I was a kid for a while, have that kind of reflexive New York snobbery about LA, where I just projected it without even, considering it. And I feel like I don't have that anymore. But for some reason, the whole city just seems really sinister to me, like threatening and ominous, like Satan lives here. I don't know what that's about, but I'd like to cure myself, some option, some alternative to hanging out with Satan. So I'm going to read 3 or 4 little short passages from the book. It's going to be maybe 20 or 25 minutes. And I'm going to start with a kind of cheerful one, and then there'll be a little bit of squalor, and then it'll be like a mix of cheer and squalor. But I'm going to dedicate this first section to my daughter Ruby, because it's the most cheerful. It's about what it was like when I first was rehearsing the first songs I was trying to write with the first band I was in, and like 1973, 74. And what that felt like when it was all completely fresh. The power and beauty of it was unimaginable until then. It can't be overstated, that initial rush of realizing, of experiencing what's possible as you're standing there in the rehearsal room with your guitars and the mics turned on. And when you make a move, this physical information comes pouring out. And you can do, are you fooling with these sounds?
No, just turn it up a little bit.
And you make, it sounds really loud to me.
No, they can't hear you in the back.
Oh, they can't? Okay. And when you make a move, this physical information comes pouring out, and you can do or say anything with it. It was like having magic powers, the ability to create action at a distance. The sounds that came from the amplifiers were absurdly moving and strange, the variety of them so wide in view of the fact that they came from flicks of our fingers and from our vocal noises, and the way that it was a single thing, an entity that was produced by the simultaneous reactive interplay of the 4 band members combining various of their faculties. We were turned into a sound, a flow of sound. I remember having a moment of weird revelation once that each moment of a phonograph record being played, each millimeter of information conveyed via the needle to the amplifier, to the speaker, to the ear, is one sound. A whole orchestra is one sound, altering moment by moment, no matter how many instruments go into producing it. And as our band rehearsed, in each moment we made the sound spray out in arrays that could instantly alter, emanating from inside us and our interplay and our inner beings being combined, playing, and the sound included words. All through this book, I've had to search for different ways to say thrill, exhilaration, ecstatic, to communicate particular experiences. Maybe the most extreme example of this class of moment is what I'm trying to describe here. What it felt like to be first creating electrically amplified songs. It was like being born. It was everything one wants from so-called God, the joy of it, the instant inherent awareness that you could go anywhere you wanted with it, and everywhere was fascinatingly new and ridiculously effective. It was like making emotion and thought physical, to be undergone apart from oneself. That's what makes the very beginning then in 1973 and 1974 different, and in a way more valuable than anything that came later in my music career, despite its shortcomings and problems and difficulties. It's that it was fresh, and every moment had that surging astonishment and pleasure, even if in the service of anger and disgust, as it often was, of anything being possible to make happen. It was like creating the world, and the feeling could never quite happen again, or be sustained anyway, because familiarity and habit take the edge off. Okay, that's that part. We're going to ride, right? No. It's funny, like somebody in one of the reviews referred to that passage and described it as being how, when I said familiarity and habit take the edge off, that it was because I started using drugs. That's what I meant by habit. That's not what I meant by habit. It was just about how that's true when you're doing something for the first time. The possibilities are endless, and then as you learn more about how to do it, you kind of tend to develop habits and fall into ruts, and you lose that freshness. It's hard to keep that from happening. So I don't know, I'm having a problem with this. So now I'm going to go to the next stage, and everything fell apart, which happened pretty quickly. This is a description of the first gig I played with that same band. And it was kind of like the beginning of the end. Yeah, and that band was Television, wasn't it? And that first gig was in like April 1974. Yeah. March 2, 1974. The room was well filled, though a lot of the crowd was invited. It was like a 200-seat theater. It was actually meant to be a screening room that we rented out for our first gig. Our second gig was when we started playing weekly at CBGBs when there weren't any other bands playing. The room was well filled, though a lot of the crowd was invited. We were all nervous. There was a tiny room off to the side of the stage where we waited to go on. I had a couple of drinks. In those days, especially, my performances took place in a puppet realm, where everything I did originated in electrical nerves from which I dangled and projected. My behavior was a combination of extreme deliberation and complete loss of control. I liked to obliterate myself with the volume and relinquish myself, devote myself into the stage lights as if they gave me privacy. My relationship was with the physics of the situation, the spotlight into which I aimed myself and my feelings, and the billowing skitters of sound pouring forward from behind me. I constantly felt this mix of consciousness that I was doing things wrong, but that I also knew and employed a magic that transformed the mistakes as they happened into glory and stick-figure beauty and power. And this is what happened. I was glad about the set we played. It worked. We were stunning, if rackety. I knew that everyone in the audience had gotten way more than their money's worth. Then I saw Tom's face when we were back off stage, and for a minute I really didn't understand. And then he said something, and I hated him. He was going to treat the show as an embarrassment, as humiliation, as nothing but an indication of how far short we were of what we should be. To him, we were all just more or less workable pieces of equipment in his shop, or livestock to manipulate. My stomach fell away. I hate the fucking sound of this microphone. It's like, I hear it ringing. Like, you have it turned up too loud. I mean, I'd rather...
I'm turning it down a bit.
Yeah. Sorry about that. I mean, my stomach fell away, but the anger couldn't be expressed. I knew from experience because that would be self-defeating. I had to. Can you hear in the back? Yeah. I had to retain belief that as the band gained experience and audience reaction, we could return to the track that we'd shared at the beginning. I had to believe that this present tension was a detour. I could see our pure existence and that all it would take would be a little bit of mutual respect and a sense of revelry in our being this band. I still held on to the hope that he could reawaken to the larger possibilities. I didn't really have any choice. I'd invested too much of myself in our prospects, so I gritted my teeth and continued. It's true that the band sounded ragged, but this was something that had also been said of the early gigs and often the later ones of the New York Dolls and the Stooges and the Velvet Underground. It was something that I positively liked in a band. It's true of the Stones' Exile on Main Street sessions, too, or some of their early singles like Who's Driving Your Plane or 19th Nervous Breakdown. Another band whose sound I'd always loved was Smokey Robinson and the Miracles, especially on a track like Goin' to a Go-Go, which sounds like it was recorded in an alley, the band banging on cardboard boxes and garbage cans. I love a racket. I love it when it seems like a group is slipping in and out of phase, when something lags and then slides into a pocket, like hitting the number on a roulette wheel, a clatter, like the sound of the Johnny Burnett Trio, like galloping horses' hooves. It's like a baby learning how to walk, or a little bird just barely avoiding a crash to the dirt, or two kids losing their virginity. It's awkward, but it's riveting and uplifting and funny. In a way, it's the oral representation of that feeling that makes the first time people feel the possibilities of rock and roll music in themselves the benchmark of hope and freedom and euphoria. But that's not what Tom was interested in anymore. He heard these crystal clear, crisp, sweet guitar suites of highly arranged series of time and dynamics sections in his head. And they were about specific parts constructed for effects where everything was subordinate to what his guitar would be doing. It was all about his composing and playing, rather than any other value of the material or band. So that's what came next. But you know, I kind of want to say something about that because another thing, I mean, in seeing how people respond to the books when they write reviews and stuff like that, they treat me, including the kind of material like what I just read, as me settling old scores or having wounds that haven't healed or something like that. And it's really not like that at all. I mean, what I was doing in the book was describing what happened as it went along. I mean, I made a point of not second guessing myself or analyzing what I just said, or said, you know, as I've matured, I've seen how this was inevitable or something like that, that I've learned from my experience. I didn't, that would have just diluted the book and been like boring detours, it seems to me, for me to like comment on what I was saying and analyze what I was saying. So when I write something like that, it's about how I felt then. You know, it's not that I'm saying it because I'm still pissed off or something like that. You know, I know that everything, all the good things and the bad things to me that I experienced and that are described in the book it's all not just water under the bridge, but it couldn't have happened in any other way. I'm just telling the story as it happens. You know, it's not because I have any kind of agenda, right? So. So next I'm going to read, I mean, you know, as it happened to me, like the way it felt to me when it was happening. Like, that's the point of writing an autobiography. So now I'm going to read a little bit longer section that's about, there's a chapter where I'm talking about a few of the people at CBGBs who were important that didn't play in bands at the club. Like I talk about Anya Phillips, who was a sort of, she was just one of the people who kind of was typical, and you know, but that makes her sound ordinary, which she wasn't. But the sort of citizenry of CBGBs. Anya, she ended up managing the Contortions, James Chance. What's that?
Yeah.
Oh, bravo. And I talk a little bit about Lester Bangs, and then I come to Peter Lochner, who was a friend of Lester's, and there was a little few pages about Peter in here, where, you know, I'm just trying to like kind of evoke what you know, the kind of, yeah, like I'm saying, the population of that moment in that place. I should take a drink of water. I haven't mentioned Peter Lochner yet either. Like Anya and Lester, he wasn't in a New York band, but he was connected to the scene. In Peter's case, he actually was a musician, but he lived in Cleveland, Ohio, and that's where his bands played. He visited New York as often as he could from 1975 until his death in 1977. And he cultivated New York friends and contacts at CBGB. He'd already made friends with Lester by writing to him at Cream before Lester came to New York. Peter was one of the founders of the interesting cold-ass industrial band Perubu, but he remained with them only long enough to play on their first single. He played in and was largely responsible for creating the earlier group Rocket from the Tombs, which was the basis for not only Perubu but the Dead Boys. Lochner was self-destructive, smart, a natural-born guitar player, and grew from the same roots, the Velvet Underground especially, as the CBGB bands. Lester and Anya and Peter exemplified something that was new about CBGB and rock and roll, and what set it apart from the British scene it sparked, in that they were intellectual. They were interested in ideas and liked to talk and think. Malcolm did too, McLaren. He was an exception in England. Anya wasn't a philosopher, but she was observant and analytical, and she respected thought and insight, even if she could be a sneering bitch, in the best sense of those words. Lester and his friend Peter were literate and interested in ideas unlike, say, Sid Vicious or the moronic, hypocritical British journal sheep, such as Tony Parsons and Julie Burchill, who, like party functionaries in Mao's Cultural Revolution, mocked Americans for reading books. Mocking books is okay. Books are a hobby, are a taste like anything else. God knows we mocked the Brits. Their hobby seemed to be potatoes. They might not have liked books, but they loved a spud. Fried potato sandwiches, the countless English storefronts serving spuds and spuds only. Every vile, dead block, it's potato shop. Peter was probably less fun and interesting to be with than Sid. Wait, that's not true. There's not much point in comparing the two. I guess the main difference in them as avatars of a kind of punkness, apart from what I've already mentioned, is that Sid stayed infantile and clownish in his fucked upness, while Peter was more melodramatic and bitter about it. In that way, Sid was a newer type and more purely punk. Peter had ideas and musical talent, but Sid didn't pretend to either of those things. Both of their stories are sad and demoralizing, and what one has to say about either one of them has to do with one's mood and whom one is talking to, because it's about the sadness of life, about suffering, about hopelessness. Sometimes one takes that seriously and sometimes one doesn't. There was an inherent contradiction in rock and roll for me. On one hand, I wanted to do it because it was physical and unhinged. On the other, I wanted to use my brain to make the song say as much as possible and to exploit every other aspect of having a band to say as much as possible too, as interestingly as possible. I was not any kind of intellectual snob. I was a high school dropout for a reason, but at the same time I wasn't ashamed of my interest in books and in thinking, and even wanted to affirm that just to make a point, America being so idiotically anti-intellectual. I felt secure enough in my credentials as the real thing in rock and roll to be able to refer to Gertrude Stein or Nietzsche or Naval in interviews. I wanted to reconcile the physical and intellectual and be seen doing it. But almost always people disregarded or misunderstood or made fun of one side or the other, or both, of what I was doing along those lines. Peter Lochner liked to think about things and analyze them too, but he was also a natural-born musician, unlike me, as well as being the most self-destructively drug-hungry drunk of all the many I've known. He just flatly yielded, no resistance to his impulses to take drugs and drink, the way anyone else would scratch their nose when it itched. Methadone seemed to be his preference, but alcohol was always present, and he took downs and codeine too. He wrote songs about Sylvia Plath and Baudelaire, as well as one called Life Stinks, and with the Dead Boys' Cheetah Chrome, the sarcastic Ain't It Fun, which Guns N' Roses later performed on their album of punk covers. He made a solo cassette tape in his room at his parents' house, accompanying himself on acoustic guitar and harmonica on what turned out to be suddenly, unexpectedly, the night his years of chemical self-abuse caught up with him and he died there in his bed of acute pancreatitis. It was 1977, and he was 24 and still living at home. The tape, labeled by him Nocturnal Digressions, is mostly others' material, and he doesn't sound well, but he plays and performs heart-rendingly. On the tape, he calls Blank Generation his favorite recent lyric, and he plays it, as well as television's See No Evil, and songs by Richard Thompson, The Calvary Cross, The Rolling Stones, Wild Horses, Robert Johnson, Me and the Devil Blues, The Velvets, Pale Blue Eyes, Eddie Cochran, Summertime Blues, and 7 or 8 more. When I knew him in New York, I didn't know about his talent, but only his drunken fanaticism. In retrospect, his story is familiar, but still, it moves me. In the mid-'80s, when I'd left music and drugs and was attempting to figure out how to write for a living, I got Spin magazine to send me to Cleveland to investigate Lochner's life. A few things became clear. The quality of his taste and talent, the depth of his self-doubt and concomitant surrender to drugs and other means of self-escape, including sexual sadomasochism, and his generosity. He encouraged and improved the lives of many people in Cleveland. He was so pure and so tainted at once. He gave people joy and tore them up. His songs held nothing back, but that could make them silly, too. Quote, Sylvia Plath was never too good at math, but they tell me that she finished at the head of her class. The week I spent in Cleveland interviewing those who'd known him, I thought about nothing but Lochner, and that was harrowing and complicated. On the last day I was there, I went by myself to visit his grave. I knew that his parents, who doted on him, he was an only child who was born relatively late in their lives, had had his gravestone engraved, "Play on, beloved son." It took me a while to find the plot. The marker was a small panel laid flush to the earth. Snowflakes were falling sparsely. As I stood there, thoughts and feelings about Lochner rushed through my mind in a ghostly torrent, impossible to read, and I was too tired and fed up to try to sort it out anyway. Then, in my extreme mixed feelings, which were largely composed of exhaustion and impatience with all the emotional information, and without quite realizing what I'd done until I spat on his grave. Okay, I'm going to read one last couple of passage. This is about the women of CBGBs. It was interesting how playing rock and roll made a person handsome. I hadn't been handsome before. My looks improved partly because I kind of knew what I was doing, that I was using the shift into music life to recreate myself, but it was also rock and roll itself. It made a person handsome. The women at CBGB were interesting too. There were intellectual high school girls and band-happy go-go dancers, pretty photographers, girl journalists, and slumming rich nightclubbing types, not to mention women band members. The topless dancers probably predominated, at least in my consciousness, but the categories overlapped. Some of the topless dancers were also intellectual teenagers who wrote about bands and came from uptown, which pretty well describes Kathy Acker, come to think of it. Most just liked to get high and spend their nights with young musicians. I liked almost all of them. Being a rock and roll musician was like being a pimp. It was about making young girls want to pay money to be near you. That was the relationship with the anonymous audience, and the audience you actually met as well. I was always ready to fall in love, but I had noticed that love comes in spurts, and that was appreciated by the women. Many of them expected or even required that their boyfriends neglect them a little. It proved how important the boyfriends were. Of course, most of the dancers came from unhappy family backgrounds. Relationships were expected to include abuse. The go-go dancers made a lot more money than the band members did, and they shared it freely. One of the most powerful mental images I retained from those days involves a girlfriend from a few months later. And, from a few months later in it just like distracts me. Involves a girlfriend from one of the most powerful images I retained from those days involves a girlfriend from a few months later in 1975, after I'd left television and had started in with the Heartbreakers. Her name was Carol, and she was a 19-year-old topless dancer from rural Pennsylvania. She had long, straight, natural blonde hair and the face of a confused cheerleader. Her body was like a compilation of American male fantasies, so youthfully ripe that while having no excess, it seemed to be straining to burst from itself, with breasts that lifted as if they were scenting the air, an athlete's high butt that sheltered under it that little concave-sided triangle of light between the tops of her thighs, behind the soft, lush, see-through blonde pubic hair, and she was uncomplicated and good-natured and desirous to please. I was doing junk pretty often by then, but it still felt deluxe. I was sure that the drug was outlawed because the arrogant rich wanted it to themselves. Sticking a needle in my arm felt adult, like I was really in charge of myself finally, running my own destiny, out from under. It was more independent than any other choice I'd ever made. Carol often had to work at night dancing in Midtown, so she wasn't always able to catch second sets at the club. She gave me the keys to her apartment, and after I was paid for a gig, maybe $50 on a good night, I'd likely go cop a couple of bags of dope and then let myself into her place to wait until she got off work at 2 or 3 a.m. One of those late nights, I was lying alone in semi-darkness in her big bed in that continuous, soft, slow-mo rippling of dope bliss, dreaming and drifting when she let herself in. The trebly crunch of the key in the door distracted me out of my nod. She saw me and broke into smiles and jumped up in her miniskirt and tight blouse onto the bed, bright-eyed, straddling my torso, standing, center panel of creased 3D panties directly above my eyes, and reached into her pockets and purses to lift out fistfuls and fistfuls of soft, crinkled money she released to float down all over me. All right, thank you. So I'm going to sign books if anybody wants a book signed.
You've been listening to the Skylight Books author reading series. Don't forget that you can check out this and all of our other great podcasts at www.skylightbooks.com. Today's music was provided by Fragile Gang. You can check them out at MySpace, Facebook, and the iTunes Music Store. Thanks for stopping by, and we hope to see you soon.